All right, Numbers 28, let's call this one reflect. Why? Because I literally had to reflect on the feast of the Lord, because during the time since we last talked about them, around about Leviticus 23, we've done a lot of chapters and I did a lot of forgetting. And so it was practical to call it reflect, because when we went through it the first time, I didn't talk about it in detail in the 5-minute lesson because I ended up talking about them in detail on Sunday. But these really are days that, apart from just the regular Sabbath day, which was just a day to really rest and not do a whole lot, these were more or less days of rest that were devoted to reflection, because they had a hook or a foundation in a particular point in Israel's history, starting off with the Passover. The Passover was the point at which God showed them mercy in two ways. One, giving them a place of their own in the first place. They're not there yet at this point in the story, but he freed them from slavery so that he could give them a place of their own with a fresh start. And that's an act of mercy. Because, as we've already said, it is not because of their righteousness, as we'll get to in Deuteronomy, but it's an act, as we said, of mercy and grace, that he is giving them the chance to get here without the cost of the life of their firstborn, which is what it cost the people of Egypt to want to hold on to them past the time when God said, let them go. But moving on, the Feast of Unleavened Bread followed close on the heels of Passover. And we said, in a practical sense, it was talking about the way in which the death of the firstborn was going to be so drastic that they were going to be cast out of Egypt, the nation that was trying to hold on to them so tightly. And they were going to have time to make everything perfect. So they needed to get ready when God said get ready, and make sure that they were ready to go. And in life, likewise, it's probably important for us to reflect on times in which we can take time to tighten up areas in our life that make us more nimble, as we talked about in a few lessons, because we don't always know when opportunities are going to come around. And there are times, as we've said, when opportunities will go to not necessarily the best qualified, but the most prepared. And if you can be the most qualified, who is also the most prepared, then you're ready to go. And that's what they were ready to do when it was time to get out of Egypt. So understand that with that, it was a twofold lesson, though. Why? Because Paul makes a lesson to the Corinthian church using this whole concept of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, because part of what they were going to do is not just make unleavened bread, but they had to get rid of all the old leaven. And when he's counseling the church at Corinth, he is telling them they need to be more introspective. In modern terms, they need to be more self-aware, because they had gotten used to some completely abnormal things that had never become normal to God. And he was telling them, you need to examine yourselves. That's literally what he's going to say later on, after counseling them to deal with a certain sin issue that was going on in the church. And likewise with us, we are counseled on the first day of the week to, as we are, if you're in a fellowship that takes communion on the first day of the week, part of that is examining yourself in much the same way that Paul challenged the Corinthian church to be self-aware about the places in our lives where things that might be completely normal to us have never become normal to God. And in many ways, like David prayed, God, search me and try me to see if there is any wicked way in me. Man, it's a tough prayer to pray, because his answer might require some changes. But in many ways, that is what the Feast of Unleavened Bread was all about. It was about being prepared to move quickly, but it was also about getting rid of all the old junk that we don't need to carry forward. And then with the Feast of First Fruits, it's not talked about much in this chapter, but First Fruits had a lot to do with understanding the quality of the sacrifice that God was making for his people, and later on in the sacrifice of the Christ. And if that's the level of sacrifice he made, what level of sacrifice should we be committed to? First fruits is what he is expecting from us for the level of commitment and sacrifice he's made for us. And then finally, the Feast of Weeks. Not a whole lot of parallels I see there. I'm sure there are other scholars who have deeper insights, but I do know at the very end of that sacrifice, there was a provision that you don't forget the poor, meaning if you understand how much God has blessed you and how much mercy he's shown you, it would be horrible for you to then turn a deaf ear to the cries of the poor. And that was a provision of the Feast of Weeks. And so in looking at these sacrifices, it is important to reflect, because life comes at you fast and it's easy to forget things that at one point were second nature. And so these are times of reflection. Likewise for us, they give us an opportunity to see how God challenged his people to reflect on some of the same things it would help us to reflect on now. So that as we often pray for him to give us his best, we are going forward in him giving our best. It's only right.